Niigaan, good to have you with us. Before we get into the AFN election, I'd like to get your thoughts on Canada's new Governor-General, the first Indigenous Governor-General, Mary Simon. What do you make of this appointment?
It's a fairly predictable choice. It's a safe choice as well. Mary Simon, of course, best known for being president of the Inuit Tuparit Kinitami, but was involved with the Chrétien government, even the Mulroney government, involved with the Constitution. Very much a person who's advocated for Inuit rights for a long time, but has also been on the government side of advocating for Indigenous inclusion in the Constitution. So a fairly predictable, safe choice, but also something that's been remarkable in lots of different ways. She began her speech today in Inuktitut, not English or French, and she in fact doesn't even speak French. So we've got some changes happening administratively at the highest level, and it's a complicated position because she may be forced to adjudicate on issues of Indigenous rights for constitutional challenges. So that won't be an easy position for an Indigenous person, but she's probably up for the task.
Moving to the AFN, and they've moved beyond the vote on delaying the vote for a new national chief. A new national chief will be selected by chiefs on Wednesday or maybe late into Thursday. But what are your thoughts on the candidates who have put their names forward?
Yeah, so it's the most diverse slate of national chief candidates in the AFN history. We've got three female, 4 male candidates, and we've got 5 provinces represented, 7 First Nations. The most diverse slate of candidates, but some of the most unknown. So what we see is a lot of regional leadership and not a lot of national vision. That's where the AFN has been going over recent years, being more of a regionally based organization. And we see that in particular the ways in which chiefs vote as a block in areas like BC, which contains 1/3 of all the votes for the national chief. The fact is that, the 2 leaders, front runners, are probably Alvin Fiddler, the Grand Chief of Anishinaabe Oski Nation, and Roseanne Archibald, the former regional chief of the Ontario for the Assembly of First Nations. So we see a lot of leadership there. It's really who's been able to take issues and be able to get some kind of play elsewhere, because everyone was waiting to hear if Jody Wilson-Raybould was going to run, and she didn't. But I think that support for a female national chief has moved over to Roseanne.
I think there was some rumor maybe that's why the BC Chiefs were trying to delay the election for Jody Wilson-Raybould. Of course, there are other resolutions aside from the one trying to delay the vote. What else are you watching for at this AFN Annual General Assembly?
Well, of course, as usual with all things AFN, it's whether the national chief sort of spouts speeches, has a tone that is friendly to the federal government or is more distant from the federal government. And as we saw with Perry Bellegarde, the outgoing national chief, the fact is that this AFN, this particular under his leadership, is probably the closest it's ever been to a federal government, harking back to the days of Phil Fontaine. So what that's led to is the record number of budgets, programming that the AFN has been able to deliver. But it's also led to a lot of number of compromises on issues like, for example, murder, missing Indigenous women and girls, those calls for justice. The government has not moved on those. The AFN hasn't been particularly proactive in calling those out. And in the specter of the internal investigation that the AFN is currently undergoing involving the treatment of women, the sexual harassment of women, it is not a good look. It's not particularly indicative of an organization that's willing to change, particularly in its treatment of women. So perhaps a female national chief, Roseanne Archibald, may signal a change of that organization. But that organization is so slow in moving and at times is very distant to the interests of everyday First Nations people. And without a deep structural change, which may or may not happen with these set of national chief candidates, the AFN will continue to be status quo.
All of that said, how big of a task does the next national chief have? And what do you see as some of the issues that need to be addressed in short order?
Well, the number one issue is this investigation involving sexual harassment in the organization. Undoubtedly, that's going to come out with recommendations, whether those changes are implemented. The fact is that whoever is the national chief will have to be a more proactive voice on the issue of sexual harassment and gender within the AFN than Perry Bellegarde was. The second issue is having to do with the implementation of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The government's going to be aggressive, is going to move forward. What they've said is that they're going to analyze every bill, every law within the House, within the government, within the next 2 years. It's whether the AFN is going to let the government lead on that issue or direct them, come up with a plan to be able to help implement and change and bring Indigenous rights into Canada's Constitution. All the complicatedness of what that involves is necessary. It must be really Indigenous-led, because if it's federal government-led, we know how that's going to turn out. Indigenous rights are going to be watered down, they're going to be controlled, and that may happen regardless. But the AFN has an opportunity to lead in that regard. And the third, as always, pretty much broken record here. The AFN constantly is in the situation of being dependent on the federal government. Will a national chief finally break from the grip of being dependent on funding, on programs of the federal government to be able to create a independent organization that's probably going to be more regionally focused? But one wonders if a national chief will move an organization to eliminating his or her own position to be able to make more regional representation, regional leadership being a louder voice than a single voice for all chiefs, which frankly is kind of really silly when you think about it. There's 634 First Nation members. It's impossible to have any one voice to be able to encompass all of that.
Niigaan, we'll have to leave it there, but always appreciate your time.
Yeah, miigwech. Thanks so much.